We're joined this week on Bronx Bombers by a very special guest, Jonathan Eig, author of Luckiest Man, which the Chicago Sun-Times called the definitive life of Lou Gehrig. And Kirkus Reviews, in their starred review, put it best, I think, when they wrote, one of those sports biographies that transcends sports, and it really does. Jonathan, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Now, before we dive into the content of Luckiest Man and Gehrig's life, I'm wondering what it was that drew you to him as a subject and inspired you to write this book.
I was a huge Yankee fan as a kid, and my hero was Bobby Mercer. But any Yankee fan growing up in any era knows the Mount Rushmore Yankees: Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, I almost said Jackie Robinson, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle. And it didn't occur to me, as a kid, Gehrig was kind of the most boring of those. But when I got a little older and I realized that, I was in my late 30s, around the same age that Gehrig was when he died, it occurred to me that I had kind of not really appreciated just what a tragedy his story was. And at the same time, I was reading Seabiscuit, and I really appreciated how great a sports book can be when it's about something bigger than sports. And Lou Gehrig's story was really about much more than baseball. It was about a man discovering that he was dying in his prime and how he faced that tragedy. And it struck me that it would make a great book if there hadn't already been a great Gehrig biography at that point.
Now, as you make very clear, Gehrig's household growing up was dominated by his mother, Christina, a very strong personality, and perhaps shaping her intensely close relationship with her son. As you put it at one point here, Gehrig was the subject of a crushing degree of attention, was the fact that Christina lost 3 children in their infancy, not unusual in those days, in the early 20th century, particularly among the economically disadvantaged, which the Gehrigs definitely were. Talk a bit about that relationship between Gehrig and his mother, Christina, in those early years, and how the intensity and closeness of that relationship really extended well into Gehrig's young adulthood.
I say in the book that if there were a Hall of Fame for Mama's boys, Gehrig would have been elected in the first class. He was so in love with his mom and so wrapped around her finger. Gehrig's father was kind of a drunk and didn't do a lot around the house and wasn't the kind of presence that his mother was. So Gehrig became even more attached to his mother for that reason. And I think that he had a very hard time outgrowing that. Even as an adult, he was still always worried about upsetting his mother. He was really, not really ready for adulthood in many ways. He, when he went to college, he decided to go to the college where his mother worked as a cleaning lady. He could have gone anywhere and escaped from home and gotten a little bit of independence, but he didn't want it. He wasn't sure what to do. And even into his late 20s, when he's this handsome, eligible bachelor, superstar baseball player, he's still going home, living with his parents and going home for dinner every night and not partying with the guys on the team. So he had serious issues when it came to his mom.
Now, Gehrig's athleticism and sheer physical strength were apparent from a very early age. He dominated at Commerce High School in New York City, not just baseball, but football as well. Excelled at Columbia University, where his mother was employed as a cook and a housekeeper for one of the fraternities there. But around that time at Columbia, he was discovered by the legendary Yankee scout Paul Critchell. And so Gehrig was signed in 23, started to get real playing time in 25, and then his breakout season was 26. But talk about the Yankees' team culture at that time, the Roaring Twenties, dominated by Babe Ruth, of course, and how Gehrig did adjusting to that culture those first few years.
It was really difficult for Gehrig. Even in college, he didn't get a chance to really grow up. He continued to live with his parents and hung around with his mother more than he hung around with his teammates on the football squad or the baseball team at Columbia. And then he joins the Yankees, and it's the Roaring Twenties. It's a wild time to be in New York. He's this handsome, eligible bachelor. Babe Ruth is having more fun than anybody alive, and Gehrig could be his running mate. Gehrig could be out there every night having a blast, and he just didn't know what to do with himself. He didn't fit in at all. And he was embarrassed. He went down for his first spring training with, just a couple bucks in his pocket and was afraid to eat out with the other guys. Really didn't know how to be around women. Even, the movies were more than he could handle. He would just go home and read books at night. So he didn't fit in at all. And I think if it weren't for his amazing abilities on the field, he would have been mocked. He would have been mocked even more than he was. He was mocked a little bit.
Now, first baseman Wally Pipp, it turns out, got a raw deal from historians. I learned that from your book. He was actually a really good ball player, but the legend that was repeated for decades was that Wally Pipp had the most unfortunate headache in the history of sports on June 2nd, 1925, that he told manager Miller Huggins that he couldn't play, and then Gehrig came in at first, and that was it for Wally Pipp so long. But that's the legend. But what really happened there, Jonathan?
The real story is that the Yankees were slumping, and Miller Huggins was looking to shake up the team a little bit, looking to maybe send a message to the starters who were lollygagging, and also just to give some of the young players a shot. He had Gehrig sitting on the bench, this big, strong kid, and Wally Pipp was really struggling, and he was starting to wind down. His career was nearing its end. So he decided to put Gehrig in, and he shook up the lineup that day, and Gehrig had a great game. And it was obvious that this kid had talent, and it just, there was no chance for Pipp to get back in the lineup. Now, if we now say someone's pipped if they take a day off and they're replaced, but in fact, he was Gehrigged. Pipp was Gehrigged, I think, because he was replaced by a better, younger alternative, and that's just the way it tends to work. There's nothing unusual about it.
Now, one thing you make very clear is that Gehrig's famous streak of 2,130 consecutive games played was no accident. It was definitely not an afterthought. It was a conscious decision on Gehrig's part early on, really just to play every day. And this was certainly true later of Cal Ripken as well. But I got the feeling reading your book that Gehrig, on some level, knew he would always be overshadowed by Ruth as a player. Not by much, but he was a good deal more overshadowed by Ruth's personality, which was just overflowing with charisma. But I almost got the feeling that Gehrig understood that there was an area where he could beat Ruth and anybody else, and that was in this area of showing up and doing the job every day no matter what, determination, grit. And Gehrig, a number of times during his career, played with injuries that would put a player today on the DL in like a heartbeat. But talk about the streak and what it might have meant to Lou Gehrig.
Gehrig absolutely knew that this was something that Babe Ruth couldn't do. And Gehrig had that, German background, that sense of hard work that his mother had given him. He really became a great baseball player, not because he was the most naturally gifted. In fact, he was a clumsy fielder. He had to really work hard to learn to be a competent first baseman, and he always believed that his greatest gift was his determination, not his natural ability. So playing every day very much fit into that personality, into that character, and into what he felt were his strengths. And, he absolutely knew he had this streak. He absolutely knew it was something that Babe Ruth could never match. Ruth was always taking time off for belly aches or for, STDs. And Gehrig was really proud of the fact that he was in the lineup every day. And in fact, he kept a box score in his wallet pretty much his whole life. From his first game in when he began that streak. And it wasn't the day that he replaced Wally Pipp. It was actually the day before when he pinch hit. So he would often remind people that the streak was actually one day longer than they thought because he was in the lineup as a pinch hitter the day before he replaced Wally Pipp.
Interesting. Now, the streak wasn't without its controversies. There were games when Gehrig was really hurting, when he was initially in the lineup but then removed by manager Joe McCarthy after an inning or so. In fact, there was at least one game you pointed out where he was really banged up, and he just played the defensive top of the first and never even came to bat. And there were grumbles from Babe Ruth. Now, that may have been sour grapes. This was after Ruth retired or was retired, and he and Gehrig had a falling out, which we'll get into, but others as well, reporters, fans, that the streak was not a good idea, that ultimately it might wear Gehrig down and shorten his career. I mean, obviously that outcome would have been vastly preferable to what actually happened, but talk about the media and fan reaction to the streak while it was happening.
It was ignored really for the first, almost the first 1,000 games. It didn't get that much attention. Then when he began passing others who had set the record, people began commenting on it. And there was a little bit of grumbling. He came out early, or he only played an inning on days that he wasn't feeling well to keep the streak alive. But, they said the same thing about Cal Ripken for that matter. And they also complained that maybe he was hurting the team, that he'd be better off if he rested a little bit. But these are unknowns, and it's just kind of the thing that reporters like to hash out because it's fun to speculate. But Gehrig said, he felt like he was more good to the team in the lineup, even if he wasn't at his best, and he couldn't help the team at all if he was sitting on the bench. And that was just his nature. He had to be in there. He felt like.
Now, the relationship between Ruth and Gehrig had its twists and turns. During those initial few years there in the mid-20s, you characterized it very nicely, I think. I'm paraphrasing, but the way you put it more or less was that Gehrig admired Ruth and Ruth liked being admired. And you also remarked that Gehrig may have been impressed on some level by Ruth's casual way of dealing with authority figures. Now, Ruth and Gehrig were sort of forced together, even after some of those seasons had ended, by their joint publicity appearances, barnstorming tours, exhibition games, and such. Talk about that relationship, some of those off-season adventures, and maybe where that friendship, if you want to call it that, took a turn for the worse.
I think they liked each other. I think they recognized that they were not exactly soulmates. But that kind of made the relationship more interesting. Of course, Babe Ruth was an orphan, and he was raised in this orphanage, and he liked the fact that he could go home to Gehrig's parents for these big fat heavy meals and be treated like a kid and be served dinner around the table. He saw Gehrig as a little brother, somebody who needed help, needed to be taught the ways of the world, and tried to introduce him to women, tried to introduce him to a slightly faster life. And Gehrig really looked up to the Babe because Babe was Babe was everybody's hero. And certainly as a kid, Gehrig thought Babe was the greatest player he'd ever seen. And I think that they had a nice kind of big brother, little brother relationship for a long time. And the barnstorming was a great way for them to cement that. They got to know each other on the road for, weeks at a time at the end of the season. And it really, I think, lasted quite a while until Gehrig met his wife, and then things got more complicated.
Well, do you want to get into that?
Sure. So Eleanor Twitchell was what they called a circuit girl. She hung around when the Yankees came to town and went to the parties with the ball players, and that suggests that you were living in the fast lane. Nobody knows for sure whether Eleanor ever slept with the Yankees when they came to town, but if you went to those parties, there was a pretty good chance that you might go home with one of the ball players, and she certainly could have slept with Babe Ruth. And when she met Gehrig at this party, Gehrig just fell in love with her and said, "I'm going to marry this girl." And he did. He started sending her like ridiculously expensive gifts before they'd even gone on a date. He was wooing her and planning to sweep her off her feet. And when they did finally go on a date, and when he proposed marriage, she was a little surprised that it was happening so quickly, but she was up for it. The only problem was that Gehrig's mother was opposed. Gehrig's mother was opposed to any girl who might steal her Louis away from her. But Ma Gehrig was particularly concerned about Eleanor because she had this reputation of being a circuit girl, and I think Ma Gehrig assumed that Eleanor had slept with the Babe, and Eleanor may have slept with the Babe. So that really tainted the relationship for Ma Gehrig and led to all kinds of problems with that. Gehrig thought that when they got married, they'd go and live with his parents, and Eleanor said no, absolutely not. But then something happened on the honeymoon. They postponed their honeymoon a little bit until this barnstorming trip to Japan, and Eleanor went along on this trip with Lou. And at one point on the boat, Eleanor disappeared. Lou couldn't find her anywhere. He was really scared. He thought maybe she'd fallen overboard. She was looking all over. He was looking all over for her, and then finally found her in the Babe's cabin with the Babe and his wife, and drunk, lying on Babe's bed. We don't know if she was clothed or not clothed. We don't know whether there was more than drinking going on. Eleanor admitted that she was in the room. She wrote in her own memoir that Lou discovered her, and that was the end of the friendship between Lou and the Babe, that Lou felt he had been betrayed by the Babe, not necessarily by his new wife. But after that, the friendship really ruptured, and you can even see it on the field. Prior to that moment, whenever Babe Ruth hit a home run, Lou Gehrig was there to greet him when he crossed the plate and to shake his hand. And if you just look at the film clips of the home runs after that moment, Lou does not reach out to shake Babe's hand. He turns his back when the Babe crosses the plate.
I never knew that. That's fascinating. I mean, as far as the media and public attention focused on those two, I almost got the feeling reading your book that given how shy Gehrig was, almost pathologically so, that this dynamic of being constantly overshadowed by Ruth was actually kind of a double-edged sword in that, on the one hand, I mean, it had to be frustrating on some level given what he was doing on the field, but Gehrig was not one to seek attention. In fact, it mortified him. So do you think there was a bit of relief as well that the spotlight focused more on Ruth and not on him?
I do think that Lou liked being in the Babe's shadow. It took a lot of pressure off of him. If he were the star of a team in a small town, he probably could have handled it and might have even enjoyed it. But to be the star of a team in New York, or to even try to compete with the Babe for attention was out of the question for Lou. So I think he felt a great sense of relief, and he was almost pathological in his shyness. Lou didn't even like signing autographs. He didn't even like the attention from kids. He never wrote a book in the off season the way Babe did for extra money. He was not interested in talking about himself. He gave very few interviews to the reporters, and when he did give interviews, he tended to really stick to the superficial. Didn't want people prying into his personal life. He was a strange guy in that way.
Now, the 1927 team, the greatest in baseball history, that's not really breaking any news there, was truly a machine, and Gehrig's 27 season is generally regarded as his best. His wins above replacement that season was 11.8. That's a career high. OPS 1240, also a career high, although typically Ruth overshadowed even that with a 1258 OPS on the strength of those 60 home runs. But Gehrig actually got the better of Ruth in RBIs by 8, which is astounding considering he hit after Ruth and so came to bat 60 plus times with the bases empty. He also had more hits than Ruth. And so while that's certainly a very strong case that the 27 season was Gehrig's best, there were other seasons that can stand right beside it. 1930, he hit 379. That's a career high. 1931, he had 185 RBIs. That remains an American League record, by the way. As you took a hard look at these performances, these all-world performances by Gehrig, Jonathan, did any doubt creep into your mind that maybe, one of these other seasons I just mentioned may have been even better than 27? Talk about Gehrig's 27 season and where it ranks in his career.
It's really hard to say. 27 was obviously an insane season, and you point out correctly that it's even more insane that he drives in all those runs with Ruth clearing the bases 60 times in front of him. I still can't quite figure out how he drove in all those runs. But I think, you can make the case that Gehrig is the greatest hitter of all time when you look at those numbers. And if you think about what would have happened if he hadn't gotten sick and played, another 4 or 5 seasons at the level he was playing, or even close, even if you factor in for the normal kind of fall off that you get with age, I think he'd be remembered right up there with Ted Williams and Babe Ruth as one of the all-time greatest hitters.
Now, Eleanor really did have a profound impact on Gehrig's life during their 8 years together. They married in 1933, and you go into quite a bit of detail on her background and personality, very different from Gehrig's on both counts. Talk about what that relationship meant to Gehrig's evolution as a human being.
Eleanor really helped him grow up. She insisted that he stop and sign autographs. Gehrig used to sneak in to the stadium. He would avoid the players' entrance just so that he didn't have to sign autographs. And Eleanor said, no, you're a star. These kids look up to you. You have to go through the players' entrance and you have to sign autographs. And she insisted that he stop just accepting whatever contract the Yankees sent him every year. She said, you should negotiate. You're the star of this team. You deserve more money. She hired a publicist for him, the same one who worked with Babe Ruth. She helped him get an audition for a Hollywood movie to play the role of Tarzan, which he didn't get because he was actually too muscular. So Eleanor really helped him. She took him into the city and exposed him to opera and theater. And I think it was hugely important for his development as a person. He began to really take a little bit of pleasure in life. It wasn't all about baseball. It wasn't all about hard work. And he was able to break free a little bit from his mother, thanks to Eleanor.
Now, Gehrig's first manager was Miller Huggins, but for most of his career, it was Joe McCarthy. And they became quite close. McCarthy, who spoke with great emotion at Lou Gehrig Day in 1939, was absolutely devastated by Gehrig's passing. He had appointed Gehrig captain in 1935. That was a role that Gehrig took very seriously. Talk a bit about McCarthy and why those two got on so well, and also how the team culture changed as it transitioned from the swashbuckling 20s group dominated by Babe Ruth to the Depression-era group that was dominated by Gehrig and then ultimately DiMaggio.
Lou always really liked authority figures, and I think almost any manager would have been like a father figure to him. And Joe McCarthy was a perfect one in many ways because McCarthy loved rules and loved operating with a set of principles, and he was a great leader, and I think the players all really liked him, but he sort of adopted Lou and tried to teach Lou to think of himself as a leader, especially with Babe fading and leaving. Gehrig really becomes the captain and the spiritual leader of the team, and he sets a much more serious tone than Babe Ruth, of course, and it's really the image that the Yankees would carry forth for generations, this business-like approach to the game. Now the Yankees are, they don't let you wear long hair or mustache or beard, right? But Gehrig is really the first. He's this strong, silent kind of a captain and makes the Yankees into this kind of a more serious bunch than they ever could have been with Babe Ruth around. And I think that's something that DiMaggio talked about a lot, that Gehrig was really a quiet leader, but he led very effectively by setting an example.
Now, your book goes into really unprecedented detail about those last difficult years of Gehrig's life and his struggle with ALS, a neurological disease that was a death sentence in 1939 and remains one today, sadly. A rare disease, thankfully, but a harrowing ordeal for the afflicted and their loved ones. But Gehrig started to experience some early symptoms during the 1938 season: weakness, fatigue, incoordination, falling down on the base paths. Talk about that initial phase of Gehrig's illness, Jonathan, and how he ended up a patient at the world-famous Mayo Clinic in Minnesota.
When Gehrig showed up for spring training in 1938, he began to complain that he didn't feel right, that he was getting blisters on his hands. He was tripping. He went golfing one day and just felt like his feet weren't coming up. He was like kicking the grass. He was tripping over curbs, and he starts constantly dropping down to a lighter bat as the season moves through. And it's as if he knows something's happening to his body, but he doesn't know what it is. And some of the reporters think, well, he's just getting old. Some of them say it's because he's never taken a day off and the fatigue is setting in, and maybe it's hitting him all at once. And by the end of the season, his numbers are down dramatically. I think he still hit like 295 and 29 home runs, drove in 114 RBIs. And so he still had what most people would consider a fantastic season. But for Gehrig, it was way off of his usual. And it's clear now that something was wrong. In the offseason, he did go to a doctor. He went to just a sort of a general practitioner, and the doctor didn't see anything wrong with him, told him to try changing his diet. And he came back in the spring for spring training, and now everybody could see something was wrong. He'd lost a ton of weight. And if you look at pictures from spring training in 1939, it's shocking, really, how he doesn't even fit his uniform anymore. And he was playing so badly that it was embarrassing to him and to everybody in the press. He was dropping easy throws. He was having trouble getting out of the way of inside pitches. He couldn't hit for power at all. Everybody was talking about it. What's wrong with Gehrig? What's happened to him? Why does he look so terrible? But he still tried to stay in the lineup. He thought maybe it was a virus and he'd shake it off. He didn't want to lose that streak of his. So he kept playing and pushing through it. He did take a couple games off during spring training, which for Lou was unusual. But when the season started, he was in the lineup. He played the first few games, and then finally, he became concerned that he was really hurting the team. There was a routine play at first base that he couldn't make. He had to, and everybody kind of congratulated him when he managed to somehow get back to the bag in time for the putout. But he knew that it should have been an easy play. And then finally, he took himself out of the lineup and agreed to go see some doctors at the Mayo Clinic, and that was it. They diagnosed him instantly. The doctors could see right away what was happening to him.
Now, the physicians at the Mayo Clinic diagnosed Gehrig correctly without any trouble, but there was a good deal of trouble in how this diagnosis was ultimately disseminated to the media and the public, and the resulting confusion created real problems for Gehrig during a very vulnerable period. You describe an article published in 1940, I believe, which implied that Gehrig may have infected his teammates who were playing poorly at the time. This is, of course, impossible. It's not a communicable disease. Gehrig sued that publication for libel, by the way. And while I'm certainly not excusing the article it's horrendously irresponsible journalism, but I can't help but wonder if the facts had been more clearly laid out to the public, then maybe that article, never gets written. So before we get to what Gehrig himself may have been told about his illness, which is a whole other story, talk a bit about what the media and the public were told at the time.
When Gehrig was diagnosed at the Mayo Clinic, they sent him back with a letter that said he had ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and they compared it. They said it was a form of poliomyelitis. And when people saw polio, they thought, oh, it's like polio. It could be contagious. So people misunderstood. And as a result of that, not only did they think that it was potentially contagious, they also thought that it was not fatal because, a lot of people survive polio and you might need braces on your legs or you might need a wheelchair. So it created a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. I think even those people who were there when Gehrig gave his farewell speech and heard him say, I'm the luckiest man on the face of the earth, even then people didn't really know for sure that he was dying. They thought maybe this was just his way of saying goodbye to baseball, that he was never going to play again. So there was a lot of confusion about it. And it wasn't all the media's fault. ALS was just completely unknown at that time. It was such a rare disease.
Well, it was unknown to the general public, but it was certainly known to the neurological community at the time, and they knew the ultimate outcome. Now, there were about 200 letters between Gehrig and Dr. Paul O'Leary, that was Gehrig's primary physician at the Mayo Clinic. And I got to be honest, Jonathan, as I read some of what O'Leary wrote to Gehrig about his prognosis, I found myself getting a little angry on Gehrig's behalf. Gehrig in his letters has been practically begging for candor about his outlook. I'll quote one here. This is Gehrig about 15 months before his death, writing to O'Leary, quote, "Please don't judge me a crybaby or believe me to be losing my guts. But as always, I would like to know the actual truth and not continue to receive encouraging reports which have little or no chance of materializing, or to continue to live in false hopes. There is definitely something going on within my body which I do not understand, and which I would appreciate immensely if you would discuss with Dr. Woltman, and please," that word's in all caps, "reveal to me your honest opinions," unquote. And here's O'Leary writing back, quote, "I know by innuendos you have the impression that people do not arrest the progress of ALS. You remember in our last talk, I tried to emphasize the point that you would probably progress to a certain degree, following which you would either remain stationary with some residual signs like numbness in your fingertips and difficulty in walking, or that there would be an improvement in many of these temporary inconveniences." And O'Leary goes on here at the end, quote, "Courage and persistence in treatment invariably result in an arrest of the process such as you have," unquote. Which, O'Leary, who was a well-credentialed physician at a first-rate facility, but O'Leary certainly knew those words were false, Jonathan. And so to my mind, I wonder if unintentionally he made a horrendous situation even worse for Gehrig by adding this element of false hopes or even guilt on Gehrig's part. He was always worried about letting people down, that his condition wasn't improving or at least remaining stationary, as O'Leary puts it. But what's your take, Jonathan, on this whole issue of candor between Gehrig and his physicians? And I use the plural because he saw a number of them both in Minnesota and New York.
It is disconcerting, and it's hard to know exactly what to make of it. I can understand why they'd want to keep his hopes up and to keep his spirits up and not tell him that this was hopeless. And in fact, Eleanor was writing to Dr. O'Leary and asking him to do just that. Eleanor was saying, we must continue to give him hope. And I don't know that was such a good thing. I mean, a lot of patients go through that. They give themselves false hope. They find some crazy new potential cure. They fly off to some foreign country to try some new experimental drug. And, it's common for people to seek some kind of a way to avoid the notion that they're doomed. But to deliberately mislead the way O'Leary did, I think is wrong. And I know that other doctors there, when Gehrig was diagnosed, I know that they told him that ALS was fatal. But nevertheless, O'Leary is creating the strong impression that those doctors may have been wrong, that there is a chance here. And as you read there, he says, invariably, this disease can be arrested. I mean, that's just a flat-out lie.
Now, did those other doctors you mentioned tell him it was fatal or that it was just incurable? Because he writes a letter to Eleanor from the Mayo Clinic, which says something like, it's likely that I'll need to walk with a cane in 10 to 15 years, and I won't be able to play ball again. That doesn't sound like a particularly realistic estimate of what was about to happen. So do you think that Gehrig, in fact, knew that his disease was fatal or simply that it was incurable?
We don't know. He may have been writing that to Eleanor to try to let her down a little easier too. But the doctors who I talked to who worked with those doctors at the Mayo Clinic, I interviewed doctors who were trained by the doctors who diagnosed Gehrig, and they said these men were such professionals and so serious that they would never have intentionally misled a patient, that they would have absolutely told him that this was fatal. But very often a patient hears what they want to hear. Some cases move more slowly than others. A patient hears that, we have had occasions where someone has lived with this for, many, many years, even decades. And that's what the patient wants to hear because that's what they need to process this. And that may be what happened to Gehrig, but ultimately we don't really know.
Okay, Lou Gehrig Day, July 4th, 1939. We all know the magnificent speech that Gehrig gave that day. It's one of the most moving ever delivered, in my opinion. Of course, the title of your book, Luckiest Man, derives from it. Now, something you cleared up for me that I've always wondered was whether that speech was delivered off the cuff or not. Tell us what you found out about any preparation that may or may not have gone into the speech that day, and any other interesting details you uncovered about that event, which was recreated magnificently in your book.
Oh, thanks. We don't know for sure. Eleanor said that he had some help from a writer, but there's really no way to know. The writer who Eleanor mentioned never took any credit for having contributed to this speech. And my strong feeling is that Gehrig did not have help, that he wrote it himself, that he may have jotted some notes the night before about what he was going to say, but he really believed that he wasn't going to make a speech that day. And I think that's the most important thing to remember, that he absolutely insisted that he was not going to speak, and he didn't even want to be out there on the field and begged Joe McCarthy to let him out of it. And when it came time to speak, he even said, no, I'm not going to say anything. And they began to roll up the microphone wires. And then Joe McCarthy pushed him out there and said, come on, you got to say something. So we don't know whether Gehrig had rehearsed these words at all, whether he had thought about what to say. But again, just given his personality, my hunch is that he had thought about what he would say. And it's so beautiful. Because it feels so unrehearsed and so unpolished, and in some ways it's even, like ridiculous. He thanks his opposing teams, he thanks the ushers, he thanks his mother-in-law, and he goes on to say basically that he's lucky, no matter what kind of a diagnosis he's received, never mind that his baseball career is over, he's lucky because he's had all of these wonderful things in his life. So it's not about this diagnosis. It's about the wonderful life that he's had up until this point, and that's why he's grateful. And that's a beautiful sentiment, something I think that continues to inspire everybody who hears it.
Now, it's always been a bit frustrating to me that we're able to hear the beginning and the end of that speech, but the rest seems to have been lost. Tell us why that might be.
Yeah, I'm very disappointed. There's only 4 sentences that survive on tape or on film, and I keep hoping that somebody's going to find one in their attic. It was recorded, it was aired on the radio, and newspaper reporters, of course, were there, and there were some cameras filming it for the newsreels, for the movie tone news, and those newsreels, they edited the parts that they wanted to use to show in movie theaters, but they shed the parts that they didn't need. And apparently nobody saved the complete footage of it. So we did not have a complete recording. I was able to piece it together as best I could from those 4 sentences that survived on film, plus looking at all of the different newspaper coverage of the event and trying to find sentences that matched up, that were reported by multiple news outlets similarly or in the same way. But a lot of the newspaper reporters quoted it differently because these guys are not using tape recorders. They're just jotting it down by hand.
Final question, Jonathan, and you've been so generous with your time. We really appreciate it. Some amusing facts in your epilogue about the 1942 film production Pride of the Yankees, a seminal baseball film. And what I found amusing was the fact that the producer, Sam Goldwyn, as well as the star, Gary Cooper, knew basically nothing about baseball, and Goldwyn was less than enthused about the project initially. You have his response here to the proposal for the film. Goldwyn said, quote, "It's box office poison. If people want baseball, they go to the ballpark," unquote. But tell the listeners how Goldwyn was ultimately convinced to produce the film, which was a big success, and how Gary Cooper adjusted to his role in that film.
Goldwyn heard Gehrig's speech. Somebody played him the film of Gehrig's farewell speech and was moved by that. And then he was also convinced that, the war was on and a lot of American men were overseas, that this could work as a love story, that there might actually be a chance to get women to show up to watch this movie by making Eleanor a bigger character and by portraying this not as a baseball story, but as a tragic tale of lost love. And that's really how they ended up selling it. That's why it has a dance scene and a musical number in there, which, is not something you'd put in for baseball fans. And Gary Cooper, grew up on a farm, a strong physical actor, but hadn't played baseball much, if at all, and you could tell, and he could not, for the life of him, swing the bat left-handed. So that became a real problem in filming this thing. The solution that they found was to sew the number 4 on the back of his uniform in reverse, and to let him swing right-handed, and to have him run to third base instead of to first base, and then to flip the film. And if you watch carefully, you can see that the shadows in the movie are wrong.
Luckiest Man. Pick it up. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local independent bookstore if they still have those. It's a gripping tale, well told, and with some remarkable photographs as well, by the way, including a few I'd never seen. Jonathan, great work here. Thank you so much for being part of the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You can follow us on Twitter. @BombersPodcast is the handle. You can also send us questions. We'll try to answer each and every week in our mailbag segment here on the podcast. You can like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher. You can also drop us a line if you want to, 646-854-4959. And as always, you can send your comments and questions to joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us. We love engaging with you.